A sopped cop chopped my pop's top. And so some of those weird words in that sentence are actually parts of Houdini. You've probably already noticed that I've been using a lot of like slang specific to Houdini because you haven't heard it in another software before. And I've been using Houdini since 1.0. A lot of these concepts and terms are like embedded in me, and if someone has never heard them before, that they don't know what they mean. So let me give you a little bit of an introduction about how to find out more about that. So in Houdini slang, Robert McGee made this video called The Secret Language of Houdini, and it kind of helps explain everything. And then there's this book. So this I just cropped off. It's like a 8.5 by 11 size book. I just cropped off the bottom part, but this is another thing. And because it's Houdini 19.5, it's going to be relevant. It's probably going to be relevant for a long time. So don't worry about the version number not being up to date. And it covers a lot of the terminology and basics of using Houdini. If you consider yourself like a pro Houdini person with several years of experience, you're pretty much expected to know most everything in this book. So let me talk about one term here called context. And contexts are the different parts of Houdini, like where you do modeling or where you do particles. And in this list here, I've listed a few, and side effects might list it differently, and maybe they have the right to do that. And so if I look at the side effects list, they have object, surface, dynamics, look dev, VFX, composite, task, render, channel. But in my list, I specified a little bit. So OBJ is object level. That's like the top or world level of Houdini. SOPs, surface operators, is where you do modeling geometry. And modeling geometry, really, as Jeff Wagner puts it, you're just moving points around. and it's kind of true. And so the geometry, it can be traditional modeling, but it's also preparing a model for an effect. So, like if you're going to emit particles from the back of a rocket ship, how do you isolate that part of the rocket ship? And how do you make sure that the particles are going to come out the right direction on the model ship, on the rocket ship? And so those are all kind of geometry, surface operator editing things. And it also includes post-processing. So a lot of dynamics things are done inside the geometry, but a specific little dynamic world node, and then you bring that back out. So you go into the dynamics world, process your geometry, and then you come out of it, and then you do post-processing to this effect, geometry, smoke, or whatever it is that you're going to do, RBD, and so that's all done within this geometry. And lighting, there's two ways of lighting in Houdini. One, the traditional way is at the object level. The new way is this LOPS lighting thing, also called Solaris. And in Houdini, it's in the second place called the stage. So then the next is the particles. And as I mentioned before, inside the geometry surface operators, we have these little dynamics things. And so there's this thing called the popnet. And the popnet is exactly what the node below is. You see, it says dynamics. A popnet is just a dynamics node with some presets set in for doing particles. And so dynamics is where we do particles, pyro, which is smoke, flip fluids, kind of watery looking stuff, and that kind of stuff, vellum, cloth work. And so that's in a dynamics node. And these dynamics nodes are contained within the geometry node. And I'm going to confuse you in a little bit. So just be prepared, because you might say, but wait. And so the materials are... So the way to make materials in Houdini, there's a couple of different ways. One is VOPs, vector operators. And it's not only used for building materials, but it's also used for building an effect. So you could say materials and effects. and even to confuse you more, now there's like a X material builder, and there's a new way of doing materials inside the LOPS surface. So, but I'm just trying to tell you what does VOPS mean. So VOPS is kind of like it's programming, but using connecting nodes. So just like we build a Houdini file out of nodes, VOPS is a way of building VEX code using nodes, using these operators. Okay, ROPS is the render outputs, and that's where we traditionally have done our rendering, not only Mantra but also RenderMan, and that's kind of being phased into this LOPS part. So, but I still use it quite a bit because it's quick and easy, and I've been doing it for a long time. The TOPS is a relatively new part of Houdini, task managers, and that's for like controlling really complicated effects. So let's say you built a really complicated effect, and let's say we're breaking down a bunch of buildings, but we don't want every building to look identical, and so tasks is a way of tasks is a way of kind of automating that so that we build a complicated effect, but we can have variations to it. That's one use for it. So, and compositing COPS is there's an old version and a new version, and the old version is node based, kind of like the rest of Houdini, and it's a little bit similar to Nuke. Nuke is way more powerful and has more features, and so it's like a super light version of what Nuke can do. And the new compositor, so the old compositor is called IMG, imaging, and the new compositor is called the CopNet. It's also called Copernicus, like the scientist. The new one is got some really cool stuff in it, which you can't really do in the old compositor, and it's like it's got stuff in there I've never seen anybody do before. So it's kind of like a whole world unto itself. But it's not quite ready for prime time yet. And so some of the basic kind of everyday compositing tools that I use to put together slap comp aren't all accessible within the new COP. So I'm going to be using the old IMG a lot. I will introduce you to the new one, but pretty much a lot of the things that I need to use compositing for haven't been built into the new one yet. So just beware. But anyway, COPS means compositing. CHOPS, channel operators, it's also called motion and audio, and that has its own area context. And VEX, vector expressions, I should have put this back up under VOPS, but vector expressions is there's two ways of using VEX in Houdini. One is you can traditionally program in like a text editor and compile something, and you build your own new node. And side effects came up with a thing called vector wrangle nodes, and wrangle nodes use something called snippets, which are little parts of codes, and so you don't have to write the whole like C++ style code to get your thing to work. You can just write the basic bare bones expression that you want something to do, and so we'll be using a wrangle node a lot, and so that's what VEX is. VEX is a programming language, kind of similar to C Shell. And I have on that same line. I got the VOPS. I got this again. So vector operators, and so VOPS is a way of doing what VEX does, but doing it with nodes. Repeating myself there. And scripting is another part of Houdini, the scripting part, and we can do text port scripting, which uses a language called HScript, and then HScript is kind of being tried to be phased out by Python scripting, but they're keeping HScript around, and I'm glad they do, because Python takes a lot more work to do the same thing that you want to do in HScript. However, Python has many more powerful features that HScript doesn't have just on a programming level. Anyway, so this is my list of context, and it's a little bit vague, and as you go by, it's kind of vague. It means that different parts of Houdini. And so there's this slang that goes along with it, the slang that goes along with the different parts of Houdini. So the Houdini slang is, so Robert McGee's video is well worth watching, and the Houdini Foundation's page is well worth watching. It's well worth watching. The op equals operator, so OP equals operator, which is a node. And so I call it a node, and I'll call it a button sometimes. I'll even call it a button, or I'll call it a tile. And it's not a button, but sometimes I'll accidentally use that. Or like a tile on a floor because it's square. And that just might be Garmanisms, not anybody else. And so context, as I mentioned before, the different parts of the Houdini, where we do world space things like set up our lighting, our cameras, geometry, particles, blah, blah, blah. Another term you hear a lot at Houdini is bake or cook. And it runs a process. And so you bake something or you cook something, it means that the Houdini processes that thing. Because we build these giant networks, they typically go from top to bottom, and it has to go through that whole operation, and so that's called cooking. And then, and if you make it, like if you save it to disk, it's called baking, or the line below, sim cache render to disk, save to disk. So first you cook and then you bake, and then I guess that makes sense if you're a baker. And then HDA, Houdini Digital Asset, that's like you make your own like little mini sub Houdini setup with just granting controls of certain things that you need to. So we'll be using that. The term that got used before HDA were OTL, operator type library. And the operator type library is like a really vague word because it's just like a library of different operators. And so it's kind of weird. And Houdini Digital Assets is a better word, but you'll see the OTL knocked around a bit. You'll hear me use the word OTL subconsciously every once in a while. RBD is rigid body dynamics. PDG is a fairly new term, procedural dependency graph, and that's part of the top section. That's kind of a new thing. That's why I put it in here. And USD is a universal scene description. It's used by many softwares. It was developed at Pixar, and I probably not even covered a third of all the terms that you're going to run. Learn a lot more, or just be aware that there's going to be more to learn and more strange terms, and write things down in your notebook. So like for me in my notebook, when I work on a show or a project, in the very back page, I have a page called glossary. And so the very back of the notebook, and so like I start my notebook at the front, but at the very back, flip open the back cover, that's my glossary page. And then I kind of work in from the back end. So it's kind of like a reverse pages in the back. And that's for terms that I don't know. And I started that method when I first went to Digital Domain, and I came from television and they were working in film, actually physical film. And there's just a lot of differences between your final output being video and your final output being film. And so I heard all these terms that I didn't know what they meant. Plus, Digital Domain, there were more sophisticated user than I ever was before I went there. And so I kept hearing terms. So I'd be in a meeting or I'd be in dailies and I'd hear a term. So I'd flip open the back of my notebook and I'd write that term just on the page. And then later on, I'd go back and define it to find out what it meant. And so I created my own little glossary. And so some of my older notebooks have a lot more terms like that in there. And don't be intimidated by it because it's intimidating. There's a lot to learn and a lot to cover, and you might be overwhelmed by it, but that's the whole idea of the notebook, and that's why you make the big bucks.